General Viktor Petrov stepped out of his luxury sedan onto the cobblestone streets of London, his chest adorned with numerous military medals that caught the afternoon sunlight. The 52-year-old commander from Eastern Europe had arrived in Britain for a diplomatic summit, representing his nation's military interests. His reputation preceded him, a man known for his iron fist, unwavering discipline, and complete intolerance for what he considered weakness or ceremonial nonsense. As Victor adjusted his perfectly pressed uniform, his aide, Colonel Dmitri, approached with the day's schedule. The general's piercing gray eyes scanned the itinerary with obvious disdain when he noticed the planned visit to Buckingham Palace. In his homeland, such pageantry was viewed as outdated theater, a waste of resources that could be better spent on actual military preparation. These British and their toy soldiers, Victor muttered to Dmitri in their native tongue, gesturing dismissively toward the palace gates visible in the distance. Playing dress-up while real armies train for combat. The general had built his career on efficiency and practical warfare. He commanded over 50,000 troops back home, had led successful campaigns in 3 different conflicts, and believed that military service should be about strength, strategy, and survival, not standing motionless in decorative uniforms for tourists to photograph. As their convoy moved through London's busy streets, Victor observed the city's blend of ancient traditions and modern life. Double-decker buses shared roads with black cabs, while historic buildings stood alongside glass skyscrapers. Yet what caught his attention most were the occasional glimpses of the famous red-uniformed guards he had heard about, the Queen's Guard with their distinctive tall black hats and pristine scarlet tunics. "Look at them," Victor commented to his entourage, pointing at a group of guards marching in formation, standing around like statues while real soldiers fight real wars. This is what happens when a military becomes nothing more than entertainment. His diplomatic mission in London was crucial for his country's future defense contracts and strategic partnerships. The summit would determine whether his nation would receive advanced military technology and training support from NATO allies. Victor understood the political importance of this visit, but his personal philosophy clashed with what he saw as British military theater. The general's harsh upbringing in a war-torn region had shaped his worldview. As a young soldier, he had witnessed the brutality of actual combat, lost close friends to enemy fire, and learned that survival depended on split-second decisions and unwavering alertness. The idea of soldiers standing perfectly still while crowds gathered around them seemed not just foolish, but dangerously soft. During the drive to his hotel, Victor's assistant briefed him on British military traditions and protocols. She explained the historical significance of the Queen's Guard, their rigorous training, and their dual role as both ceremonial guards and active soldiers. But Victor's mind was already made up. These were not real soldiers in his estimation, merely actors in elaborate costumes. "In my army," Victor told his staff over dinner that evening, "a soldier who stands motionless while people mock him would be court-martialed for dereliction of duty. A real soldier responds to threats, protects his position, and maintains operational security at all times." The hotel dining room buzzed with conversation from other diplomatic guests, many of whom shared stories about London's attractions and customs. Victor listened politely, but remained unconvinced about the value of British ceremonial traditions. His decades of military experience had taught him to judge effectiveness over appearance, substance over style. That night, as Victor reviewed briefing documents about the next day's events, he paid particular attention to the security protocols around Buckingham Palace. The schedule included a formal ceremony where various international military leaders would observe the changing of the guard. Victor saw this as an opportunity to assess what he considered the weakness of his potential allies. His aide, Dmitri, knocked on the door with updates about logistics and transportation. As they discussed the following day's arrangements, Victor expressed his intention to test these ceremonial guards. to see if they possessed any real military bearing beneath their colorful uniforms. "Perhaps we should maintain diplomatic courtesy," Dmitri suggested carefully, knowing his commander's tendency toward confrontational testing of other military units. Victor waved off the concern. "Respect is earned through strength and competence, not through wearing a fancy hat. If these guards want to be considered real soldiers, they should act like real soldiers." As London settled into evening quiet, Victor stood at his hotel window overlooking the city lights. Tomorrow would bring his first direct encounter with the Queen's Guard, and he was already planning how to evaluate their military worthiness. In his mind, a true test of any soldier was how they responded under pressure, how they maintained their composure when challenged, and whether they could distinguish between genuine threats and theatrical display. The general retired to bed that night, confident in his assessment and convinced that the following day would prove his point about the superiority of practical military training over ceremonial pageantry. He had no idea that his assumptions about the Queen's Guard were about to be challenged in ways he never anticipated, and that his actions would set in motion consequences that would forever change his understanding of what it truly means to be a professional soldier. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as General Viktor Petrov arrived for the diplomatic ceremony. Dressed in his full military regalia, complete with ceremonial sword and chest full of medals, he walked with the confident stride of a man accustomed to commanding respect through intimidation and authority. The international delegation gathered near the palace gates, where they would observe the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Victor surveyed the scene with critical eyes, noting the tourists with cameras, the organized barriers, and the pristine formations of guards in their scarlet uniforms and towering bearskin hats. "Quite a production," remarked Ambassador Richardson, the British diplomat assigned to escort the foreign military leaders. "The ceremony dates back centuries and represents the continuity of British military tradition." Victor nodded politely but internally scoffed. In his estimation, true military tradition was built on battlefield victories and tactical innovation, not choreographed parades for entertainment. As the guards began their precise march across the courtyard, Victor observed their synchronized movements with professional interest, looking for flaws in their formation or signs of military weakness. The ceremony proceeded with clockwork precision. The old guard marched out in perfect formation, while the new guard took their positions with mechanical accuracy. Every step was calculated, every movement rehearsed to perfection. The crowd of onlookers watched in respectful silence, many taking photographs of the impressive display. But Victor grew increasingly frustrated with what he perceived as theatrical nonsense masquerading as military professionalism. These soldiers moved like wind-up toys, he thought, following predetermined scripts rather than demonstrating real situational awareness or adaptive thinking. As the formal ceremony concluded and the diplomatic party moved closer to the palace entrance, Victor noticed one of the Queen's guards standing at his post near the main gate. The young soldier, Lance Corporal James Mitchell, stood absolutely motionless, despite the growing crowd of tourists who had gathered to take pictures and attempt to provoke reactions. "Watch this," Victor whispered to Colonel Dmitri, speaking in their native language. "I'll show you what passes for military discipline in this country." Despite Dmitri's subtle attempts to discourage him, Victor approached the guard with deliberate intent to test his composure. He began with seemingly innocent questions, speaking loudly enough for nearby tourists to hear. "Soldier, are you even awake under that ridiculous hat?" Victor called out, positioning himself directly in front of Lance Corporal Mitchell. In a real army, guards maintain visual contact with potential threats. The guard remained perfectly still, eyes fixed straight ahead, breathing steady and controlled. His rifle remained at the precise angle required by regulations, and his posture showed no sign of acknowledgement or response to Victor's provocations. Emboldened by what he interpreted as weakness rather than discipline, Victor stepped closer. "Perhaps you didn't hear me, boy. I am General Victor Petrov, commander of the 3rd Armored Division. In my army, soldiers acknowledge superior officers." Still no response. Lance Corporal Mitchell had undergone extensive training for exactly these situations. He understood that his role required absolute composure regardless of provocation, that his duty was to maintain his post with unwavering professionalism, and that reacting to taunts would compromise both his mission and the reputation of his unit. Victor's frustration mounted. In his military culture, silence in the face of a superior officer's address was considered insubordination worthy of immediate punishment. He began to pace back and forth in front of the guard, speaking louder and more aggressively. "Are you deaf as well as useless?" Victor demanded. "What kind of soldier ignores direct communication? In a real combat situation, this kind of behavior would get your entire unit killed." The crowd of tourists began to take notice of the confrontation. Some started recording with their phones, while others whispered among themselves about the foreign officer's behavior. Ambassador Richardson, noticing the developing situation, began moving toward them with obvious concern. Victor, now fully committed to his demonstration, decided to escalate his test of the guard's responses. He moved even closer, invading the soldier's personal space while continuing his verbal assault. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," Victor shouted, his voice echoing off the palace walls. "This is exactly what's wrong with Western militaries. All show, no substance. You're nothing but a toy soldier playing dress-up for tourists." Lance Corporal Mitchell's training kicked in completely. Despite the verbal abuse and aggressive posturing mere inches from his face, he maintained his position with remarkable self-control. His breathing remained steady, his grip on his rifle unchanged, and his gaze fixed on the horizon beyond Victor's shoulder. Victor interpreted this continued composure as confirmation of his theories about British military weakness. In his mind, a real soldier would have either acknowledged his rank or taken defensive action against what could be perceived as hostile behavior. The guards' seeming passivity only reinforced Victor's belief that these ceremonial positions were filled by soldiers lacking real military training or backbone. "Pathetic," Victor muttered, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "This is what happens when armies prioritize appearance over capability. These aren't soldiers, they're mannequins in costume." As Victor prepared to escalate his demonstration even further, he remained completely unaware that his every action was being carefully observed and recorded. He didn't notice the discreet security cameras capturing his behavior, the plainclothes officers monitoring the situation, or the fact that Lance Corporal Mitchell's apparent inaction was actually a masterful display of the very military discipline Victor claimed to value. The general's misunderstanding of the situation was about to lead him into far deeper trouble than he could have imagined. His assumption that the guard's composure represented weakness rather than strength was a fundamental error that would soon expose Victor's own lack of understanding about true military professionalism and the serious consequences of his disrespectful behavior. Victor's aggressive confrontation with Lance Corporal Mitchell reached a dangerous turning point when he made a critical error in judgment. Believing he had encountered a weak soldier who wouldn't respond to verbal intimidation, Victor decided to physically test the guard's reactions by reaching toward the young man's rifle. "Let me see if this weapon is even functional," Victor announced loudly, extending his hand toward the guard's rifle barrel. "Or is it just another prop in this elaborate theater?" The moment Victor's fingers made contact with the rifle, everything changed. Lance Corporal Mitchell's training, which had kept him motionless through minutes of verbal abuse, now demanded immediate action to protect his weapon and position. The guard's response was swift, precise, and completely professional. "Stand back! Do not touch the rifle!" Mitchell commanded in a voice that carried across the courtyard with unmistakable authority. His movement was controlled but decisive as he adjusted his grip and stance to secure his weapon while maintaining proper protocol. Victor stumbled backward, genuinely shocked by the sudden transformation of what he had assumed was a passive, decorative soldier. The young man's voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone trained for combat, and his protective stance over his weapon demonstrated real military bearing. Within seconds, the situation escalated dramatically. Palace security personnel, who had been monitoring Victor's increasingly aggressive behavior, moved swiftly to intervene. Armed plainclothes officers appeared from seemingly nowhere, while uniformed police began clearing the immediate area of tourists and onlookers. "Sir, step away from the guard and identify yourself," commanded Inspector Sarah Walsh of the Metropolitan Police, her hand resting meaningfully on her radio. Behind her, additional security personnel formed a protective perimeter around Lance Corporal Mitchell while maintaining clear sight lines throughout the area. Victor's military instincts finally engaged, but far too late. He suddenly realized that what he had interpreted as weakness was actually extraordinary discipline, and that his actions had triggered a genuine security response from highly trained professionals. The casual atmosphere of the tourist area had vanished, replaced by the tense efficiency of a potential threat situation. "I am General Viktor Petrov," he announced, attempting to regain control of the situation through his rank and diplomatic status. "I was simply testing the readiness of your ceremonial guard. This is a misunderstanding." Inspector Walsh's expression remained professional but firm. "Sir, regardless of your rank or position, physical contact with a Queen's Guard and their equipment constitutes a serious security breach. You'll need to come with us for questioning." As Victor was escorted away from the immediate area, he caught a glimpse of Lance Corporal Mitchell returning to his position with the same composed demeanor he had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. The young soldier's face showed no anger, no smugness, just the calm professionalism of someone who had handled the situation exactly as his training required. Ambassador Richardson appeared at Victor's side, his diplomatic composure barely concealing obvious frustration and concern. "General, I'm afraid there are serious consequences for your actions today. Interfering with palace security is not taken lightly, regardless of diplomatic status." The questioning that followed was thorough and uncomfortable. Victor found himself in a secure interview room, explaining his actions to a panel that included military intelligence officers, diplomatic security personnel, and representatives from his own embassy who had been summoned to address the international incident he had created. "General Petrov," said Colonel Margaret Hayes of British military intelligence, "you've been in London for less than 24 hours and have already created a significant diplomatic incident. Can you explain what motivated your confrontational behavior toward one of our guards?" Victor attempted to frame his actions as a professional assessment of military readiness, but his explanations sounded increasingly hollow in the sterile environment of the interview room. The officials present had access to complete video recordings of the incident, witness statements from multiple sources, and detailed reports from the security personnel who had responded to the situation. "The Queen's Guard you confronted," Colonel Hayes continued, "Lance Corporal James Mitchell, is a decorated veteran of 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan. His service record includes commendations for bravery under fire and exceptional performance in hostile environments. The composure you witnessed today is the result of extensive training and real combat experience." This revelation hit Victor like a physical blow. His assumption that the ceremonial guards were inexperienced soldiers playing dress-up had been completely wrong. The young man he had taunted and attempted to intimidate was actually a combat veteran whose apparent passivity had been a demonstration of superior military discipline, not weakness. As the questioning continued, Victor learned more uncomfortable truths about his situation. The incident had been witnessed by hundreds of people, recorded on multiple devices, and had already begun circulating on social media platforms. His behavior had not only embarrassed himself and his country, but had also compromised the diplomatic mission he was supposed to represent. The British officials made it clear that while they understood the cultural differences that might have contributed to his misunderstanding, Victor's actions could not be overlooked or excused. Physical contact with a guard's weapon was treated as a potential assault on a member of the British Armed Forces, and the security protocols he had triggered were designed to protect both the palace and the guards themselves. "Your diplomatic immunity protects you from criminal prosecution," explained the embassy representative, who had been called to manage the situation. "However, the political consequences of this incident will be severe. The summit you came here to attend, the defense contracts your country hoped to negotiate, and your own military career are all now in jeopardy." As the reality of his situation began to sink in, Victor realized that his prideful attempt to demonstrate the superiority of his military philosophy had instead exposed his own ignorance and lack of judgment. The soldier he had tried to humiliate had shown greater professionalism and restraint than Victor himself had demonstrated, and the consequences of his actions were spreading far beyond the palace gates where his confrontation had begun. The consequences of Victor's actions unfolded swiftly and mercilessly over the following days. By evening, footage of his confrontation with Lance Corporal Mitchell had gone viral across social media platforms, with millions of views and thousands of comments condemning his disrespectful behavior toward the Queen's Guard. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as "Foreign General Humiliates Himself at Buckingham Palace." Victor sat in his hotel room, stripped of his diplomatic privileges and facing immediate recall to his home country. The phone calls from his superiors had been brutal. Defense Minister Kozlov's words still echoed in his ears. 30 years of military service destroyed in 30 minutes of stupidity, Victor. You've embarrassed our nation on the world stage. The international summit Victor had come to attend proceeded without him. Defense contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars were suspended indefinitely. NATO partnerships that his country desperately needed were placed under review. His actions had single-handedly damaged his nation's military relationships and strategic interests for years to come. Colonel Dmitri knocked softly on the door, carrying newspapers from multiple countries. Every publication told the same story from different angles, but all concluded that General Viktor Petrov had displayed shocking ignorance and disrespect toward British military traditions and personnel. "The Prime Minister is holding a press conference in an hour," Dmitri reported quietly. "He's expected to formally apologize to Britain and announce your immediate retirement from active duty." Victor stared out the window at London's skyline, his reflection showing a man who looked decades older than he had just days before. His chest full of medals, once worn with pride, now felt like a mockery of genuine military honor. He had spent his entire adult life building a reputation for strength and leadership, only to destroy it through arrogance and cultural blindness. A special delivery arrived that afternoon that would complete Victor's humiliation and education. Ambassador Richardson personally delivered a formal letter accompanied by a detailed military service record. The documents belonged to Lance Corporal James Mitchell, the young guard Victor had so thoroughly misjudged. "I thought you should understand exactly who you confronted," Richardson said, his tone professional but pointed. "Perhaps it will help you comprehend the magnitude of your error." Victor read through Mitchell's service record with growing shame and disbelief. The 23-year-old soldier had enlisted at 18 and volunteered for combat deployment within 2 years. His first tour in Afghanistan included 7 months of active combat operations, during which he had distinguished himself in several firefights and earned commendations for courage under fire. During his second deployment, Mitchell had been part of a unit that held a forward position under siege for 3 days against overwhelming odds. His citation for valor described how he had maintained his post despite enemy fire, coordinated ammunition distribution among wounded comrades, and helped evacuate casualties under direct assault. The same composure Victor had mistaken for weakness had kept Mitchell alive and saved the lives of his fellow soldiers in genuine combat situations. The letter from the British Ministry of Defense was equally enlightening and humbling. It explained that Queen's Guard positions were filled exclusively by active-duty soldiers from elite regiments, including the Grenadier Guards, Coldstream Guards, and Welsh Guards. These units maintained rigorous training standards and required extensive combat readiness alongside their ceremonial duties. "The soldier you attempted to intimidate," the letter stated, "represents the finest traditions of British military service. His ability to maintain composure under provocation while remaining alert to genuine threats exemplifies the professional standards we expect from all our personnel." Victor learned that the Guard's apparent immobility was actually a sophisticated form of situational awareness. They were trained to distinguish between tourist harassment and real security threats, to maintain communication with support personnel through subtle signals, and to respond with appropriate force when circumstances demanded action. Their stillness was strength, not weakness. The most devastating revelation came in a personal letter from Lance Corporal Mitchell himself. Rather than expressing anger or resentment, the young soldier had written with remarkable maturity and understanding. "General Petrov," the letter began, "I hope you understand that my lack of response to your words was not disrespect toward your rank or person. Our training teaches us to maintain our posts regardless of provocation, to honor our duty above personal comfort or pride. I bear you no ill will and hope this incident might lead to better understanding between our military traditions." Victor read Mitchell's letter multiple times, each reading deepening his shame and respect for the young man he had so grossly misjudged. The soldier's gracious response highlighted the contrast between true military character and Victor's own behavior. The flight home was a journey of reflection and regret. Victor's fall from grace was complete. His rank stripped, his pension reduced, his reputation destroyed. The man who had commanded thousands of soldiers and influenced national defense policy was returning home in disgrace, his career ended by his own prejudice and pride. As the plane lifted off from London, Victor caught one last glimpse of the city where his worldview had been shattered. He thought about Lance Corporal Mitchell, still standing guard at Buckingham Palace, still embodying the discipline and honor that Victor had failed to recognize or respect. In the months that followed, Victor would struggle to rebuild his life and find meaning beyond military service. He would eventually become an advocate for cultural understanding between military forces, speaking about his experience as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and assumption. The young Queen's Guard, who had taught him the most important lesson of his military career, continued his service with quiet dignity, never knowing how profoundly his professional composure had changed the life of a foreign general who had learned too late the true meaning of military honor and respect.